right, so today we're taking a deep dive into the life and legacy of Robert Mugabe, a figure who, well, his legacy is really complicated. I mean, this is a guy who led Zimbabwe for almost 40 years, from 1980 to 2017. How does someone go from being hailed as a liberation hero to becoming such a controversial figure?
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. And the sources we have paint a very interesting picture, to say the least. We've got some excerpts from this YouTube channel called Daateku channel. Seems to have a more, personal take on things. That we'll be looking at his Wikipedia page, which, is more the official record, so to speak.
Right, yeah. We'll definitely have to compare and contrast, see where they line up and where they diverge. So I guess our mission today is to explore both the good and the bad, the highs and lows of Mugabe's career, from, the fight for independence to all the controversy that surrounded him in his later years.
Absolutely. We'll try to uncover how his actions really shaped Zimbabwe's path and maybe try to wrap our heads around the complexities of his legacy.
Definitely, because it is complex. So where do we even begin with a figure like Mugabe?
Well, his early life is pretty interesting. Believe it or not, he actually came from very humble beginnings, grew up in a rural village. It wasn't exactly the kind of background that screams future dictator.
Oh, yeah, that is surprising. So what were some of the early influences that shaped his worldview?
His Jesuit education seems to have played a big role. His teachers, particularly this one priest, Father Jerome Ohia, really emphasized ideas of racial equality. And they also instilled in him this fascination with Irish rebellion against the British. Kind of ironic, don't you think, considering what happened later on?
It really is. Makes you think about those early seeds of rebellion and how they might have grown. But, the source material also talks about how academically gifted he was. Like, he earned multiple degrees while he was in prison, economics, law.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Prison basically became his university. That kind of dedication to learning, even under those conditions, it says a lot about his drive and his intellect.
Right.
And it actually makes you wonder, did that knowledge, like his grasp of economics, did it influence his policies once he was in power?
That's a good question. It also makes you wonder how someone with such a sharp mind could make some of the decisions he made later on. Decisions that really hurt his country. So how did this educated young man go from intellectual to revolutionary?
Well, he started out as a teacher in southern Rhodesia, got involved in politics early on, first joining ZAPU, one of the first movements for black majority rule. But then later he co-founded ZANU, a rival party that was, more militant in their approach to ending white minority rule.
So we're talking about Rhodesia here, which was still under white minority rule at the time. And these two parties, ZAPU and ZANU, they were both fighting for black liberation, but with different approaches.
Exactly. ZAPU, initially led by Joshua Nkomo, they were more about diplomacy, trying to work things out through negotiations. But ZANU, with Mugabe as a key figure, they were more ready to take up arms. It was during this period of intense political activism that the Rhodesian government arrested him. He ended up spending 11 years in prison.
11 years, wow, that's a huge part of his life. I can't imagine how that experience must have shaped him.
Oh, it was definitely pivotal. While he was imprisoned, he kept studying, further developing his intellectual side, and he really became this symbol of resistance, a key leader within ZANU. But it was also during this time that he started, advocating for violence against white Rhodesians. That really laid the foundation for his controversial image later on.
Right, even in these early years, you see this duality, a fight for liberation, but also this willingness to use harsh methods.
Yeah, exactly. It's a thread that runs through his whole career. It really makes you think, was this inclination toward violence always there? Or was it, a result of what he went through, a response to the oppression that he and his people faced?
That's a really interesting question, and it sets the stage for what comes next. The journey to independence and his rise to power. last time we left off with Mugabe in prison, right? 11 years for speaking out against the Rhodesian government. Really cemented his ideas about using force to get what he wanted. But then he goes from prisoner to leading an independent Zimbabwe. How'd that happen?
Well, 1980 was a huge year for Rhodesia. They held their first ever truly democratic elections, and Mugabe, newly released from prison, comes back from exile like a conquering hero. But he knew to win. He couldn't just appeal to the more hardcore supporters.
Had to tone it down a bit, play the political game.
Exactly. Had to kind of soften his image, focus on bringing people together, reconciliation, appealing to white voters too. And you know what? It worked. He wins the election in a landslide, becomes the first prime minister of the brand new nation of Zimbabwe.
That's wild. Talk about a transformation from revolutionary to statesman. But now he's in charge. What happens to all those ideas he had for Zimbabwe? How did they become policy?
Right. Well, first, everyone was super optimistic.
Right.
I mean, they renamed the country, renamed the capital. Mugabe's talking about racial harmony, building a bright future for everyone. He put a lot of resources into education, healthcare, all good stuff.
Sounds like he was really trying to make good on his promises.
Yeah, to a certain extent. But remember his economics background. That came into play big time. He had this kind of socialist vision, but he also knew how to be practical, knew they needed foreign investment to get things going.
So this balancing act, socialist ideals meet economic realities, but didn't he also start consolidating power around this time? The source material mentions something about a ZANU-PF business empire and controlling the media.
Oh yeah, you're definitely picking up on that. It's one of those contradictions. While he's rolling out social programs, he's also creating a system that benefits his party. Limits other viewpoints, something you see with a lot of post-colonial leaders. This need to maintain stability, but also the temptation of power.
Power corrupts, right? But we can't forget about the assassination attempts against him during this time. Talk about pressure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Trying to keep the country from falling apart, dealing with threats to his life, consolidating power. It was intense. Some people argue that all that pressure contributed to his turn towards authoritarianism later on.
Yeah.
But before we go there, we got to talk about the Gukuruhundi, the darkest chapter of his rule.
Yeah, this is where things take a dark turn. We're talking about the brutal crackdown on supposed ZAPU supporters in Matabeleland back in the 80s. Just horrific violence from what I understand.
It was, remember that rivalry between ZANU and ZAPU? Well, after independence, some ex-ZAPU fighters were accused of being dissidents, and Mugabe uses that as an excuse to unleash the 5th Brigade. This special unit, trained by North Korea, loyal only to him, and they targeted the Ndebele people, who were mostly associated with ZAPU.
I mean, it's hard to even read about the things that happened. Mass killings, torture, rape, villages destroyed, tens of thousands of innocent people dead. How could this happen under the leadership of someone who fought for liberation, promised peace?
That's the million-dollar question. The one that hangs over Mugabe's legacy. Some say he saw ZAPU as a threat to his power and just used this as an excuse to eliminate his rivals. Others say it was driven by ethnic tensions, this need to control the Ndebele people.
Either way, it was a horrific tragedy. What makes it even worse is that Mugabe never admitted any wrongdoing, just swept it under the rug, called it all a bunch of lies.
Yeah, that denial, deflecting blame. It's a big part of how he stayed in power for so long. He controlled the narrative, intimidated the media, made it dangerous to speak out against him.
It's chilling. It's like those ideals of freedom and justice got lost somewhere along the way.
It really is a tragedy. And the Gukuruhundi wasn't the only example of this violence and intimidation. He used it to get what he wanted. And we see that same pattern again with the land seizures starting in the late 90s.
Right, the land seizures. This is when his government started forcibly taking land from white farmers, saying it was about righting historical wrongs, redistributing land to black Zimbabweans. Was it really about land reform, though? Or was there something else going on?
It's complicated. On the one hand, land ownership in Zimbabwe was a direct result of colonialism. White farmers owned way more than their fair share of the good land, while a lot of black Zimbabweans had no land or were pushed onto less fertile land. So land reform made sense. So
redistributing the land was a worthy goal, but it sounds like the way it was done was the problem.
Yeah, instead of a carefully planned, equitable process, it was chaotic and violent. White farmers were driven off their land with little to no compensation.
What about the black Zimbabweans who were supposed to benefit from all of this? Did they actually get the land and the support they needed to farm it?
That's where things get messy. The government didn't really have a plan for how to redistribute the land. A lot of the people who got it didn't have the resources or the skills or the infrastructure to farm it successfully. And all the violence surrounding the seizures completely disrupted agricultural production. So Zimbabwe's agricultural output just tanked.
Wow. So even though the idea of land reform might have been good, the way it was done really backfired.
You could say that. It was this mix of genuine goals and political maneuvering. Mugabe was facing more and more opposition. The economy was struggling. By targeting white farmers, he could rally his base, shift the blame, make himself look like the champion of the people.
Almost like a distraction from the country's other problems, but there had to be consequences, right?
Big time. The land seizures wrecked the Zimbabwean economy. Agricultural production plummeted. Food shortages. People had to rely on foreign aid. The economy went into a tailspin. Hyperinflation went through the roof.
Yeah, I remember reading about people having to carry around bags of cash just to buy groceries. It must have been a nightmare.
A total economic collapse. And of course, the international community responded with sanctions, which just isolated Zimbabwe even more and made the crisis worse. But even with everything falling apart, Mugabe just wouldn't let go of power. Became more and more authoritarian, more paranoid.
And isn't this around the time that Grace Mugabe, his second wife, starts to play a bigger role? Their relationship was quite a scandal, especially since it started while his first wife, Sally, was still alive.
You're right, Grace was a lot younger than him. And their relationship kind of became the symbol of how out of touch Mugabe was with the everyday struggles of Zimbabweans.
And Grace, she quickly became known for her extravagant lifestyle and her political ambitions. She was a powerful figure in ZANU-PF. Some even thought she might take over from Mugabe.
Yeah, her rise in the party was controversial. A lot of the old guard saw her as power-hungry and unqualified, and her growing influence combined with the country's worsening situation. Well, it all set the stage for a major showdown, but that's a story for next time. So we're in the 2000s now, and things are, well, they're not looking good for Zimbabwe. The economy's in shambles. Mugabe's grip on power is slipping. And then a new challenge pops up.
Lay it on me.
A new opposition party, Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, led by this guy Morgan Tsvangirai, really start to challenge the status quo, give voice to all the people who are fed up with how things are going.
It says here that the 2000 parliamentary elections were a real turning point. Mugabe's party is ZANU-PF. They actually lost their 2/3 majority. They couldn't just change the constitution whenever they wanted. I bet that was a shock to the system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is the first time his authority was seriously challenged, and his response, well, it was a mix of repression and political maneuvering, anything to hold on to power.
And then the 2002 presidential election was even worse, right? It was full of violence. Accusations of rigging Mugabe seemed desperate to stay in control.
It was a mess. The international community condemned it as totally unfair. More sanctions against Zimbabwe, which just made the economic situation even worse.
So you've got the opposition gaining strength. The economy is on life support. The world's turning against him. What was going through Mugabe's head at this point? Did he realize how badly he'd messed things up?
Hard to say. He kept blaming the West for Zimbabwe's problems. Said the sanctions were just another form of colonialism. It seemed like he was living in this bubble surrounded by people who just told him what he wanted to hear.
Classic case of losing touch with reality. But even with all this going on, he still managed to hold on to power for another 15 years. How?
Well, he still had some support, especially from those who remembered him as the liberation hero. Plus, he controlled the military and the security forces, used violence and intimidation to silence anyone who spoke out against him. And he was a master at manipulating people, dividing his opponents, playing them against each other.
Then came the 2008 elections, which were even more controversial than the last ones. Tsvangirai and the MDC looked like they might actually win, but the violence after the first round was just horrific.
It was a bloodbath. Hundreds of MDC supporters were killed or injured. Tsvangirai had to withdraw from the runoff for his own safety. Mugabe wins, but it was a hollow victory. Everyone knew it was rigged. Even some African leaders started to distance themselves from it.
This is where his grip on power really starts to weaken, right? Even his allies are like, okay, this is too much.
Exactly. The pressure was on for him to step down. But instead of resigning, he agrees to this power-sharing deal with Tsvangirai. The Southern African Development Community helped broker it. Mugabe stayed on as president, but Tsvangirai became prime minister. Supposed to stabilize the country, lead to a peaceful transition.
So did it work? Did they actually try to work together?
Not really. It was a dysfunctional relationship. Mugabe didn't want to give up any real control, and he kept undermining Tsvangirai. The economy didn't recover, human rights abuses continued. It bought them some time, but it didn't fix anything.
What a mess. So what finally brought Mugabe down?
Well, in 2017, at 93 years old, Mugabe makes a huge mistake. He fires his vice president, Emerson Mnangagwa. Most people saw it as a way to pave the way for his wife, Grace, to take over.
Wow, talk about a miscalculation. I guess he underestimated how angry that would make people within his own party.
Big time. A lot of people in Zain UPF didn't like Grace. They thought she was unqualified and power-hungry. They were worried she'd ruin the country. And the military, which had always been loyal to Mugabe, they decided to step in.
No way.
Yep, they put him under house arrest and demanded he resign.
I bet people were freaking out after all those years Mugabe's actually out.
People were celebrating in the streets. Relief, hope, maybe a little disbelief. The Mugabe era was finally over.
What happened to Grace after that?
She basically disappeared from public life, kept a low profile.
Yeah.
Her political dreams were crushed.
So Mugabe is out, Mnangagwa's in her. A new chapter for Zimbabwe. What about Mugabe? Did he ever regret anything? Did he show any remorse for all the damage he'd done?
He lived for 2 more years after he was forced out. Died in 2019. Sometimes he sounded bitter about what happened, called it a coup, defended his record. But he never really admitted any wrongdoing.
Sounds like he went to his grave thinking he was right.
Yeah, maybe. He was a complicated guy. He thought of himself as a liberator, even though he became an oppressor. His legacy is full of both good and bad. It shows how a fight for freedom can turn into a reign of terror, how power can corrupt even those with good intentions.
So after this deep dive into the life of Robert Mugabe, what are the takeaways? What can we learn from all this?
I think it's a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked. Mugabe shows us how a hero can become a dictator, how a movement for liberation can become oppressive. It's a reminder that we always have to hold our leaders accountable, that a free press and a strong civil society are so important for preventing abuses.
It's also a reminder that history isn't black and white. Mugabe was shaped by his time, by his experiences, by colonialism, the Cold War, the complexities of African politics. He was a liberator and a tyrant, a visionary and a despot, all at the same time.
Exactly. His story makes us confront those contradictions, to see the nuances of history, to understand that even people who do terrible things can also do great things, and that the fight for justice and equality never ends.
I like that. Well said. So that wraps up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Robert Mugabe. A journey through Zimbabwean history full of hope and despair, resilience, and ultimately a reminder of the strength of the human spirit.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it inspires our listeners to keep learning, keep questioning, keep trying to understand this complex world we live in.
Well said. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for those deeper understandings.
Jiva kutembea